How and where the most famous American criminal died. Did you know one of America's most notorious criminals caught syphilis in his youth? And without treatment, it turned into neurosyphilis, stealing his mind and body? We'll dig into that shocking downfall soon. But first, let's ride into the stories of these criminals, their rises, their reigns, and the moments that brought them all crashing down. Let's get started. Clyde Barrow became famous during the depths of the Great Depression for a daring, violent crime spree that made headlines across the United States. As one half of the outlaw duo known in headlines as Bonnie and Clyde, he and his partner, Bonnie Parker, captured the public imagination with a string of bank robberies, shootouts with lawmen, and dramatic prison breaks. Newspapers sensationalized their exploits, portraying them alternately as ruthless killers and romantic rebels, and solidified their journalistic name, Bonnie and Clyde, in the annals of American criminal folklore. Clyde Chestnut Barrow was born on March 24, 1909, in Tellico, a tiny agricultural settlement in Ellis County, Texas. He was the fifth of 7 children in a tenant farming family that barely eked out a living on worn-out land. From his earliest years, Clyde showed a restless streak and a flair for music. He dreamed of strumming guitars and playing saxophone, but the relentless demands of farm life offered little room for such reveries. Instead, he learned the inexorable rhythms of back-breaking labor, sowing in the spring and harvesting in the fall, while his parents and older siblings struggled to put food on the table. In the early 1920s, the Barrows joined the tide of Dust Bowl migrants seeking better fortunes in the cities. They settled in West Dallas, a hardscrabble neighborhood of makeshift shacks and open-air tents, where the children of impoverished families scavenged work wherever they could. School attendance became sporadic for Clyde, and the ragged streets introduced him to petty theft as a means of survival. He and his brother Buck would later joke that stealing turkeys or a loaf of bread was no more shameful than going hungry. At 17, Clyde took his first major step off that precarious path. He rented an automobile and simply failed to return it. Arrested for auto theft, he quickly discovered that the law viewed him as a repeat offender, and short jail stays followed. Released between sentences, he graduated to shoplifting, burglary, and safecracking, developing a reputation among rural sheriffs and small-town marshals. By his early 20s, the young Barrow was a known fugitive throughout North Texas, his name whispered in police stations from Dallas to Fort Worth. On January 10, 1930, Clyde met 19-year-old Bonnie Elizabeth Parker, a Waco waitress with poetic leanings. Their connection was immediate, forged during Clyde's sporadic stints behind bars. According to legend, Bonnie smuggled a pistol into the McLennan County Jail, enabling Clyde and 2 cellmates to stage a daring escape in March of that year. Their freedom lasted barely a week before recapture, but it cemented a partnership that would soon terrorize the central United States. Prison hard labor at Huntsville and later the Eastham Farm hardened Clyde further. Enduring crowded barracks, brutal work details, and rampant violence, he resolved never to return. In late January 1932, he deliberately maimed himself, severing parts of 2 toes, to force a hospital transfer, and 6 days later walked free on parole, thanks in part to petitions by his mother and local connections. His right foot forever impaired, he adopted a permanent limp and a thin sock over the missing toes. Back in Dallas, honest work at a glass factory proved unbearable under the weight of past convictions and constant police surveillance. Embracing the only life he knew, Clyde recruited Bonnie and a handful of associates, mostly relatives and fellow ex-cons, to form what became known as the Barrow Gang. They began with small gas station holdups and grocery store stick-ups, but soon set their sights on banks. Armed with a potent Browning automatic rifle, Clyde led daylight raids that grew increasingly audacious and deadly. Between 1932 and spring 1934, the Barrow Gang carried out more than a dozen bank robberies, numerous convenience store holdups, and even kidnappings of small-town lawmen. In every confrontation, they stood ready to fight. At least 10 officers and several civilians were killed during their spree. The most sensational incident occurred in Joplin, Missouri, where a gun battle with police left 2 officers dead. In the aftermath, Bonnie and Clyde abandoned undeveloped film that would show Bonnie smiling with a cigar and pistol, igniting a media frenzy that cast them as glamorous outlaws. Their weekly exploits filled newspaper front pages and newsreels, fueling public fascination and bounty hunters alike. The fledgling FBI joined state authorities under the direction of former Texas Ranger Frank Hamer, whose relentless pursuit would soon corner the pair. As summer 1934 dawned, the duo remained on the run across multiple states, eluding capture but carrying the weight of ever-increasing rewards on their heads. On the morning of May 23, 1934, their flight came to a sudden end near Gibbsland, Louisiana, guided by the elder Methvin, whose son Henry was a Barrow Gang recruit. Hamer and a posse lay in ambush along State Highway 154. At about 9:15 a.m., Bonnie and Clyde drove a stolen Ford V 8 into the trap. Lawmen unleashed a fusillade of over 100 rounds from shotguns, rifles, and pistols. Clyde was struck in the head and died instantly behind the wheel. Bonnie, hit numerous times, fell beside him. Their bullet-riddled bodies remained on public view in a Gibbsland jail, drawing crowds and sealing their legend in blood. Though their reign of terror lasted less than 2 years, Bonnie and Clyde's saga became an enduring chapter in American outlaw lore. Their story has inspired countless songs, films, books, and museum exhibits, from the landmark 1967 movie that redefined the antihero archetype to vintage postcards of their mangled Ford. Clyde Barrow's life, from impoverished farm boy to public enemy number one, remains a cautionary tale of desperation, loyalty, and violence, forever intertwined with the mythic image of Bonnie and Clyde racing into the wind. Charles Ponzi became famous in the early 1920s for orchestrating a massive financial fraud that promised investors impossibly high returns in just days. Newspapers quickly dubbed his operation the Ponzi scheme, cementing his name in journalistic lore as the archetypal swindler of modern times. At its peak, his scheme collected millions of dollars from small-town Americans and big-city professionals alike, all drawn by the siren call of a quick fortune. Yet beneath the veneer of prosperity lay a collapsing pyramid of debt that would send Ponzi to prison and push him into obscurity and poverty before his death. Charles Ponzi was born Carlo Pietro Giovanni Guglielmo Tebaldo Ponzi on March 3, 1882, in Lugo, a small market town in Italy's Emilia-Romagna region. The son of middle-class parents, he showed early flair for languages and numbers, but family finances were modest. As a boy, he dreamed of travel and wealth, and he devoured tales of Switzerland's banks and London's trading houses. At age 17, after a brief stint at the University of Rome, he took his first step toward adventure by boarding a transatlantic liner bound for Montreal in November 1903. After landing in Canada, Ponzi drifted through a series of low-paid jobs: janitor, dishwasher, accountant's clerk, learning English and the rudiments of North American business culture. He briefly joined the Canadian Army during the Boer War effort, but deserted after a few weeks, an act that later left him vulnerable to charges of desertion. Seeking greener pastures, he hopped freight trains down to the United States, arriving in Boston in 1907 with little more than ambition and a flair for languages. In Boston, Ponzi's fortune-seeking instincts led him into a string of ill-fated ventures. He worked as a teller in a bank, then as a clerk for Western Union, and even sold baked goods door-to-door. Each enterprise ended in disappointment or allegations of impropriety. By 1919, plagued by debts and under investigation for fraud, he was fired from his bank clerk post. Yet it was in the back rooms of his modest South End boarding house that he stumbled upon the idea that would make and unmake him. The inspiration came from International Reply Coupons, IRCs, stamps used by World War I correspondents to pay postage on replies across borders. Noting that IRCs bought in Europe cost far less than their U.S. value after postage conversion, Ponzi realized he could purchase coupons overseas in bulk and redeem them in America for profit. He presented the concept to friends as a low-risk, high-reward arbitrage, ignoring the crushing costs of international shipping and exchange that made genuine profit impossible at scale. In January 1920, Ponzi opened an office at 12 South Street in Boston and began selling investment certificates, promising 50% profit in 45 days or 100% in 90 days. Word spread like wildfire. By spring, investors lined up around the block, and Ponzi's receipts soared into the millions. He leased lavish offices, bought a luxury car, and treated himself to silk suits and opera outings. Newspapers heralded him as a financial wizard, and the term Ponzi scheme entered the public lexicon as he became the face of get-rich-quick dreams. But the scheme's engine was built on a simple deception. Early investors were paid not from coupon profits, but from the funds of later investors. As redemptions accelerated, Ponzi struggled to attract enough new money. In July 1920, a skeptical editor of the Boston Post hired an investigator who exposed the impossibility of Ponzi's arbitrage. Facing a wave of redemption requests and with his bank accounts frozen, Ponzi saw his empire crumble almost overnight as panicked investors rioted outside his offices. Authorities moved swiftly. In August 1920, federal agents charged Ponzi with mail fraud, bank fraud, and larceny. At his trial, prosecutors detailed how he had siphoned investor funds into personal luxuries, paying returns with fresh deposits. Convicted in November, he received a prison sentence of 5 years at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. After release, he was indicted again on state charges in Massachusetts, leading to 2 additional sentences that kept him behind bars well into the 1930s. Deported to Italy in 1934 after completing his sentences, Ponzi tried starting anew in his homeland, but found doors closed against a man so notorious. He drifted through Europe, then settled briefly in Spain, only to be expelled at the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. In 1942, he secured passage to Brazil, hoping for another chance. Instead, he lived out his final years in Rio de Janeiro, eking out a meager existence under an assumed name and facing constant health struggles. Charles Ponzi died of complications from advanced liver disease and malnutrition on January 18, 1949, in a small Brazilian charity hospital. He was penniless, largely forgotten by the public he had so dazzled and devastated decades earlier. Though the man behind the legend died in obscurity, his name endures every time a new fraud arises. The Ponzi scheme remains a cautionary term in finance, a reminder that when promised returns seem too good to be true, they almost always are, and that even the grandest dreams of wealth can collapse on the weight of deception. Alphonse Al Capone rose to prominence during the Prohibition era by building one of the largest and most profitable organized crime empires in American history. Operating out of Chicago throughout the 1920s, he masterminded bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and bribery on a massive scale, earning him the journalistic monikers Scarface for the distinctive facial wound he received in a youthful brawl, and public enemy number 1 as law enforcement sought to bring his operation down. His combination of ruthless violence, political graft, and spectacular public persona made him the most famous gangster of his day, and a permanent symbol of the darker side of the Roaring Twenties. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York, to Italian immigrant parents, Gabrielle and Teresa Capone. He was the 4th of 9 children in a densely packed tenement building in the neighborhood of Park Slope. As a boy, he attended school sporadically, preferring the streets where he joined local gangs and learned the arts of intimidation and petty theft. His quick temper once earned him a slashing cut across his left cheek, a wound that would later become his signature Scarface. By his mid-teens, he was already working for small-time criminals, running errands, shakedowns, and minor robberies in New York's underworld. In 1919, at age 20, Capone moved to Chicago at the invitation of his mentor and organized crime pioneer Johnny Torrio, who offered him a position in the expanding bootlegging business. Torrio recognized Capone's ambition, intelligence, and willingness to use violence, and groomed him as his protege. When Torrio survived an assassination attempt in 1925 and retired, Capone assumed control of the Chicago outfit. At just 26 years old, he was at the helm of a criminal enterprise that would grow into a multi-billion-dollar operation in today's terms, overseeing breweries, distilleries, and smuggling routes that funneled untold quantities of illegal liquor into the city's speakeasies. Under Capone's leadership, the outfit adopted a semi-corporate structure with strict hierarchies and disciplined enforcement. He cultivated relationships with politicians, police officials, and city judges, bribing them to turn a blind eye or to interfere when rival gangs or federal agents got too close. At the same time, he maintained a carefully managed public image, donating to charities, throwing lavish parties, and cultivating media contacts who portrayed him as a benevolent benefactor to destitute immigrant communities. This two-pronged approach, bribery mixed with public relations flair, cemented his reputation as both a fearsome underworld boss and a folk hero to some segments of the population. The peak of Capone's power came in 1929, during the height of Prohibition. His organization controlled the city's most profitable bootlegging networks, operated hundreds of illegal bars and gambling dens, and ran an elaborate system of safe houses and hit squads. Violence was never far from the surface. Turf wars with rival gangs like the North Side Gang claimed dozens of lives, and Capone himself ordered multiple assassinations to consolidate his dominance. Yet he was careful enough to avoid conviction for murder or racketeering, insulating himself behind layers of lieutenants and corrupt officials. One of the most notorious episodes associated with Capone was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre on February 14, 1929. Members of his gang, disguised as police officers, lined up 7 members of the North Side Gang against a garage wall and executed them in cold blood. Although Capone denied involvement, the massacre intensified public outcry and galvanized law enforcement efforts to bring him down. It also marked the beginning of his slow descent, as city and federal authorities collaborated more closely and media coverage painted him as the face of unchecked criminality. Despite overwhelming evidence of murder and bootlegging, Capone eluded conviction for years thanks to his network of paid-off judges, jurors, and prosecutors. Ultimately, it was the ingenuity of Treasury Department agent Elliot Ness and his team of untouchables that led to his downfall, not for violent crime, but for tax evasion. In 1931, Capone was indicted on charges of failing to pay federal income taxes on his illegal earnings. The trial, widely publicized, ended in conviction and a sentencing to 11 years in federal prison. He served time at Atlanta's U.S. Penitentiary and later at the newly opened Alcatraz, from which he was released in 1939 due to declining health. Capone's final years were marked by rapid mental and physical deterioration. He had contracted syphilis in his youth, and without effective treatment his condition progressed to neurosyphilis, causing dementia and paralysis. After his release, he lived quietly with his family in Palm Island, Miami Beach, under the care of his brother and sister. Once a titan of vice whose wealth and influence dominated Chicago's underworld, he spent his last days nearly blind and mentally incapacitated. On January 25, 1947, at age 48, Al Capone died of cardiac arrest precipitated by pneumonia and complications from advanced neurosyphilis. His death marked the end of an era, the fall of the quintessential Prohibition-era gangster whose life story would be retold in countless books, films, and songs. Though he was gone, the legend of Scarface and Public Enemy No. 1 endured, a testament to both the allure and the perils of absolute power in America's underworld.